Welcome to the Preserving Family Podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to equip you to gain insight, information, and inspiration to help you protect, teach, and guide your family during these turbulent times. Our goal is to provide tools and resources to help you strengthen and preserve your own marriages and families. Now here are your hosts, Dr. Mark and Janie Ogletree.
Well, everyone, welcome. And I want to make a little course correction. We just had a podcast episode. We just recorded a podcast episode and launched one this week on this topic of parents who sometimes stand in the way of their children getting married when they're dating someone who's awesome and spectacular and wonderful. And I said we were going to follow that up with another episode, which we are. That episode is created and it's ready to go. But because of our crazy schedule and a few other things in our lives that are going on, I wanted to interject just another episode before we launch into this next one on the topic of grit and resilience. Now, we've done these before, but this one's going to have a new twist. So on April the 16th, I was invited to speak at what we call Silicon Slopes Mental Health Town Hall and join a few other speakers, and to all kind of address the topic of resilience and this idea of that the month of April in Utah is Resilient Utah Month. I'm not sure if any of you knew that. I didn't know that. Anyway, I prepared a message for that conference, and I wanted to share it with you today. I wanted to kind of share with you what I'm going to be doing at that conference today, which by the time this episode airs, the conference would have ended and my message would be over. But I just want to talk to you about this topic once again because I continue to see this incredible need for grit among not only our youth, but even parents sometimes. I even had a parent recently come into my counseling office and say, you know what, I need more coping skills to deal with some of these challenging things in my life. Without saying it, she was saying, I need more grit. And it's certainly something that we could that can be developed. I totally believe that grit is a trait that we can teach and help develop it in the lives of our own selves and certainly, or in the lives of our children. Now, what's on my mind right now is this idea, and I want to be careful when I say this because I know that there will be some people that will be offended, and there's no offense intended. I just want to make an observation that I think most of us would say, yeah, that sounds right. And that is that, previous generations collectively probably had a lot more grit just by nature. In fact, I can look at my own parents' and grandparents' lives where they worked on a farm, and I have a dad that woke up every morning having to milk a cow. They walked to school, sometimes a couple miles. I'm not going to say uphill both ways in the snow, but they did walk to school. They had to work. In the case of my dad, they had to go to war. They have a dad that's the same age as President Oak, so the Korean War was a war that they went and fought in. The world was just a lot different in those days. We understand that. And I'm not saying that we can't have resilient youth today or resilient adults, because we can. And there are hard things that we have to face. In fact, the world that we're facing right now, talk about a horrible intersection of events as a generation that maybe hasn't been as prepared as they could be with resilience. And then on the other end of that, a world that's just crazier than ever. And then on the other end of that, a world that's been brought right into our living room with technology. And so it's pretty crazy what we're facing today. But yeah, I think there was a lot more resilience collectively in the older days, and generations have become softer. I know that my parents thought our generation was a soft generation because we didn't have to go off to war. But yet we still, worked. I mean, I remember falling asleep in English class in high school because I was so exhausted because I worked till 11 o'clock almost every night of the week at a grocery store. We worked hard. There was a lot of other things that we did. But anyway, and I do I want to make sure that it's very clear that we have resilient youth today. We do, among us. We have people who are doing gritty things. And I'm very proud of so many who do. But once again, just dealing with this collectively for a minute, if anyone doesn't like what I'm saying, let me just say this. Okay, you tell me that an individual, a young 13-year-old boy, let's say, growing up today, who according to the Pew Research Center will spend 7 hours today on screens. You tell me that young man is going to be as resilient as a young man who grew up 20, 30, 40 years ago, who didn't have a screen, and who did walk to school, and who did have a job after school. And you just go down the list, and yeah, that's going to be a hard comparison, right? Generally speaking. Now, to have some fun with this, I got to tell you that I've heard some comedians talk about it, but it is almost hilarious how unsafe we probably were back in my day and in the days previous. I mean, literally, I have a good friend of mine telling me that he remembers going on a family vacation when he and his wife first were married back in the early 80s. And their 2-year-old son that they just had up on the dashboard, the front dashboard of the car, as they were driving, asleep. Whatever they could do to get him to sleep. And of course, you'd go to jail if someone saw you doing that today, right? And not saying that's right at all, but growing up in a generation with not really wearing seatbelts. Seatbelts weren't a thing. In fact, I didn't start wearing a seatbelt until I went into the mission field, and our mission, that was a requirement. You had to make sure you had your seatbelt on. I'd never worn a seatbelt in my life. You would think that I would be kind of prone to that, having a father who was killed in his 30s because of a car accident where he was ejected from the car from not wearing a seatbelt. But anyway, playgrounds are always fun to talk about, because the playground equipment, when my generation were younger, it was quite incredible. In fact, I just always remember that everyone had scabs, and someone always had a broken arm. We were always signing someone's cast, right? In fact, if you had a broken arm, people envied that, right? People wanted that. In fact, I remember a couple contests with my brother and other boys in the neighborhood where we're like, man, this guy has a cast, that lucky guy. And we're jumping off the roof of our house. We're taking jumps out of trees to see who could break their leg first, I mean, that's how crazy we were in those days. But the merry-go-round, literally you are all pushing it as far, it's not as high, but you're pushing it as fast as you possibly can. And you're hanging on by the pole, you launch yourself and you're hanging onto this pole, and you are completely horizontal as you're hanging onto this thing, blowing in the wind. Or one of the contests was, now you have to walk across it. Now that it's pulling G-forces, you have to walk across it with no hands, and then when you fall off, you hit the hard ground, and then you tumble, for about 20 or 30 yards, and your brain is scrambled, and then you get up and do it again. The slides that were 2 stories high, the swings that were 2 stories high that we're launching ourselves out of. So yeah, we've come a long way in terms of safety, right? Now our children are going to playgrounds with helmets on and cushions, and that. You know what? Maybe in a lot of ways, maybe that's better, right? I'm going to read this to you from Jean Twenge, her book on iGen, the iPhone generation. She says, overall, children are much more carefully protected than they once were. As Hannah Rosen observed in The Atlantic, that's the journal, the magazine, actions that would have been considered paranoid in the 1970s, walking 3rd graders to school, forbidding your kid to play ball in the street, going down the slide with your child in your lap, are now routine. In fact, they are the markers of good, responsible parenting. These are not just perceptions. In 1969, 48% of elementary and middle school students walked or rode a bicycle to school. By 2009, only 13% did. Even among those who lived less than a mile from school, only 35% walked or bicycled in 2009, down from 89% in 1969. And then she made this observation. She said, rules like this and the forms that accompany them were unheard of during Boomers and Gen Xers' childhood. Now, once again, I understand that. I understand that the world is not as safe as it may have been, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I remember allowing our young children to ride their bikes to the elementary school in Mesa, Arizona, and I wasn't as worried about them getting in a bike wreck. I was just worried about suspicious people, right, and messing with my kids in some way. So we get it, but at the same time, maybe there can be a better balance. Now, once again, it's going to be difficult for a generation of children and teenagers to learn how to be resilient and tough and gritty if they don't have to do hard and difficult things, right? If they are on a screen for 7 hours a day and they're very sedentary, that's not going to foster, inner strength and fortitude and grit, right? So here's Dr. David Fassler, a child and adolescent psychiatrist and clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Vermont, who said that too many teenagers these days just haven't had enough bad things happen to them. And in order for children to learn how to cope with normal frustrations, with ups and downs, they have to experience them first. A child cannot possibly develop resilience when their parents are constantly at their side, interfering with the development of autonomy, self-management, and coping skills. Now, once again, in our last podcast episode, we spent some time talking about helicopter parents who now are helicoptering their adult children to the degree where they're putting their foot down and saying, no, you will not marry that person, not for any other reason other than, no, I don't want you to right now. I want you to get through graduate school and then we'll talk. And then another great quote from the book, The Price of Privilege, from Madeline Levine. By allowing our children to get occasionally bruised in childhood, we are helping to make certain they don't get broken in adolescence. And by allowing them their failures in adolescence, we are helping to lay the groundwork for success in adulthood. Or in other words, you begin with the end in mind, right? Stephen R. Covey used to say that. President Oak said it a different way. Where will it lead? Where will the coddling and the helicoptering and the snowplow parenthood, what does that look like when our children are 30 and 40 and 50 years old and they've never had to do anything hard, right? I like that a few years ago at a family reunion, my wife was really big on this, and it was really amazing how our grandkids got into it. But we had them memorize the poem Good Timber by Douglas Mallock. The tree that never had to fight for sun and sky and air and light, but stood out in the open plain and always got its share of rain, never became a forest king, but lived and died a scrubby thing. And the man who never had to toil to gain and farm his patch of soil, who never had to win his share of sun and sky and light and air, never became a manly man, but lived and died as he began. Good timber does not grow with ease. The stronger the wind, the stronger the trees. The further the sky, the greater the length. The more the storm, the more the strength. By sun and cold, by rain and snow, in trees and men, good timber grow. Where thickest lies the forest growth, we find the patriarchs of both. And they hold counsel with the stars, whose broken branches show their scars. Of many winds and much of strife, this is the common law of life. But I go back to this idea that the person who never had to toil to gain and farm their patch of soil, who never had to win their share of sun and sky and light and air, and never became a strong person, we'll say, but lived and died as they began. Good timber, no, it does not grow with ease. The stronger the wind, the stronger the trees. And so let's talk about what grit really is. This is principle number 2 now. What is grit? Angela Duckworth put that expression on the map when she wrote her book called Grit. And if you don't have it, I recommend it. Grit is passion or perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future day in and day out, not just for a day, not just for a month, but for years, and to make that future a reality. Daniel Coyle, in his book, The Little Book of Talent, 52 Tips for Improving Your Skills. It's a great book. He said, grit is that mix of passion, perseverance, and self-discipline that keeps us moving forward in spite of obstacles. It's not flashy. And that's precisely the point. In a world in which we are frequently distracted by sparkly displays of skill, grit makes the difference in the long run. It really does. Once my son was described on the BYU football team as one who just brought his hard hat and lunch pail to work every day. And in my mind, that's such a gritty statement, right? A lot of us hear that and we're like, I know exactly what that means. So back to Angela Duckworth and her research. She talked about working strenuously towards challenges, maintaining effort and interest over years despite failures, adversity and plateaus in progress, the ability to get knocked down and rise up again, the ability to do hard things, the desire to work hard, to outwork others, right? What she learned in her research is that grit was more of an indicator of success than just about anything else. In fact, no matter how talented a person is, if they don't have grit, they won't make it. And everyone, I don't know why, but this just flashed in my mind, 9th grade football. Houston, Texas, Spring, Texas, the Klein Bearcats. I remember there was a young man on our team who was a specimen. He was one of those kids that just, here we were 14 and 15-year-olds. He looked like he was about 22. Just ripped with incredible biceps and chest and abdomens. He had a six-pack before anyone else had six-packs. Just an incredible athlete. And I remember we were doing this drill called ups and downs, where we ran in place and then dropped all the way to the ground and then popped back up again and ran in place. And our coach liked to make us do that for a long period of time till sometimes people were throwing up. And I remember Chris, who probably would have been an all-state athlete in Texas by the time he was a junior or senior in high school, just getting up, walking away, and saying, I'm done. And once again, no one had more talent on our high school football team than Chris. No one was more gifted physically, but yet he didn't make it. He didn't cut it. He was gone. He was done. He never played ever again. And maybe what we could say now, looking back, is maybe he lacked some grit. Angela's Duckworth's research shows that grit, passion, and perseverance for long-term goals is a stronger predictor of achievement than talent or traditional measures of ability. Now, at West Point, as you know, and this is from her book, thousands apply and only 1,200 actually are enrolled, yet 1 in 5 cadets drop out during the most intense 7-week training known as the Beast. And once again, the Beast is, it's just what it sounds like, right? It's just an intense, physically stressful, straining exercise that goes on for 7 weeks, right? It's basic training at its finest. Surprisingly, the whole candidate score, which weighs an SAT, ACT scores, class rank, leadership ratings, and physical fitness, had no correlation. It did not predict who survived the Beast. Even the highest scoring cadets quit at the same rate as the lowest. But when over 1,200 cadets took Duckworth's grit scale, grit emerged as the highly reliable predictor of who persisted through the Beast. And that was replicated, that study was replicated over multiple years. Similar other patterns appeared in other settings, and Angela Duckworth is reporting all this. In fact, one sales company with a higher turnover found that it was the grittier employees who stayed longer. In the Chicago public schools, grit predicted the on-time graduation more strongly than awareness, motivation, or perceived safety. Across universities, adults who completed advanced degrees, an MBA, a PhD, an MD, a JD, were consistently grittier than those who stopped at just a bachelor's degree. Across diverse environments, military, corporate, and educational people, grit consistently outperformed talent, test scores, and credentials as a predictor of long-term success. One of the great lessons in my own life that I don't mind sharing. Because I will be the first to admit that in my doctoral cohort of about 8 students, I probably was the least qualified academically. I got into that doctoral program by the skin of my teeth, so to speak. And there were some, I'm talking majorly academically gifted individuals in that program that I was always so intimidated by. They would give us 500 pages of readings out of journals and other places to read in a week's time and then come back and discuss it. And here were my colleagues in my cohort just discussing these issues with such fluency and expertise. And I'd listen and go, how did you get that out of that? I was just so happy that I was able to finish the reading. I don't even know if I remember anything I read, right? And then having a fluent conversation about those things, that just wasn't going to happen for me. I mean, it did happen in some cases, but it was more rare. I was very aware that I was the mule at the Kentucky Derby in my doctoral program, at least academically. And then when it was time to take our comprehensive finals, and if you don't know what a comprehensive final is in a doctoral program, it's pretty intense. You study for the whole summer. And that's what I was doing, and I thought I was pretty well prepared. There were 3 questions. That's it. Imagine taking an exam with 3 questions, and each question required about 2 hours of writing. So you're sitting in a computer lab, they give you 1 question, and from memory, you just write for the next 2 hours. And on one of those questions, I was the only one in our program that they failed me on one of the questions. They just said, we don't like what you wrote. We think you need to do it over. And I have that kind of tenacity that I'm like, do it over, huh? You want me to really do it over? All right, I'll do it over. Watch this. They asked me to rewrite about 10 pages. I wrote 50 pages just to say, here you go, guys. Here you go. You asked for it. You got it. And I think they're like, okay, we get it. But anyway, I had a really cool experience that I hope to continue to pass down to my children and grandchildren. When it came time to graduate, in that cohort of 8, there may even have been 10 of us, I was the first one who finished. And I remember telling that to my professor, who was the leader of my committee, and saying, this is like kind of almost humorous that I'm the first one to finish. We all know that I'm where I stand academically with this group. And my professor stopped me. He said, don't talk that way about yourself. Come on, you've got what it takes. But he said, look, the prizes in life don't always go to the smartest. In fact, they rarely do. They go to those who work the hardest and those who persevere. Now, this was in 1999. Angela Duckworth's book had not come out yet, but I think what my professor was really saying is the prizes don't always go to those who are the most academically gifted or intellectually blessed. The prizes go to the grittiest, is what he was saying. The prizes go to those who are willing to work the hardest. And so hopefully we know that as adults, and we feel that we possess some grit. But are we passing that down to the next generation? That's the real key. So principle 3 today is just teaching our children about grit and helping them to become gritty. I found this great quote from Carol Dweck. Here's what she said. If parents want to give their children a gift, the best thing they can do is to teach their children to love challenges, to be intrigued by mistakes, enjoy effort, and keep on learning. That way their children don't have to be slaves of praise. They will have a lifelong way to build and repair their own confidence, she said. Because really what we're doing, everyone, is we're trying to prepare our children for adulthood, and we're trying to prepare them to know that life is not always going to be easy. Life is going to have difficulties. So, passing on grit to the next generation. Here's from some research. I'm quoting from the Journal of the Society for Research on Adolescence. Teens with warm, respectful, and demanding parents. So think of that combination, warm, respectful, and demanding. Earned higher grades in school, were more self-reliant, suffered from less anxiety and depression, and were less likely to engage in delinquent behavior. So, in the old days, we called it Baumrine's model, Diane Baumrine's model of parenthood, where we had authoritarian parenting, we had neglectful, we had permissive, and then we had authoritative. And now with authoritative, Some of our scholars today are calling that actually wise parenting. And what is wise parenting? It's parents who are supportive, but also demanding at the same time. So parents who are loving and kind, but they have expectations, and they're teaching their kids how to work and to do hard things. Now here's from Angela Duckworth. She said this: growing up with support, respect, and high standards confers a lot of benefits, one of which is especially relevant to grit. In other words, wise parenting, there you go, high on demand, high on love, high on warmth, encourages children to emulate their parents. It is remarkable how many paragons of grit have told me, with pride and awe, that their parents are their most admired and influential role models. These exemplars of grit grew up not just imitating their parents, but also emulating them. If you want to bring forth grit in your child, first ask how much passion and perseverance you have for your own life and goals. Then ask yourself how likely it is that your approach to parenting encourages your children to emulate you. Because, by the way that works, if you want your parents to emulate you, you got to have a great relationship with them, right? Well, one of my favorite stories, because I'm a major BYU football fanatic, not just fan, but fanatic, is the great story of Steve Young showing up on the BYU campus and finding out not long after he shows up that he's the 8th string quarterback on the roster and probably is never going to have a chance to make it. And he is helping run the practice squad. They call it the meat squad, the group of players that are helping the starters get ready for the next game by imitating the plays and some of the patterns of the team they're going to play that week. And Steve was just getting beat up. He's just getting beat up. And he's not going to play. He's not going to start. He's a freshman. But he decides that he's done. He's going to quit. And he calls his dad. And by the way, what's his dad's name? Grit. I mean, you talk about a parent who's going to pass down grit to the next generation. Start with just being named Grit, right? Steve calls his dad Grit Young, and says, "Dad, I'm done. I'm quitting. I'm coming home." He says, "My bags were already packed." What does his dad say? He says, "You can certainly quit, but you can't come home. I'm not living with a quitter, so you can decide for yourself." And Steve said, "I hung up mad, but I stayed at BYU." And by the way, that grit and that perseverance paid off. Steve Young becomes one of the greatest, most prolific quarterbacks in Brigham Young University football history. But he also ends up becoming a great NFL player, an all-pro player, a Super Bowl winner, and all because of grit, right? Now, my question to you is, do your children know your grit stories? Because I believe that most adults and probably teenagers have a grit story stored away somewhere, maybe even 2 or 3, maybe even 5 or 10. Parents sharing their grit stories gives children a living example of what perseverance actually looks like, not just what it sounds like in theory. When children hear how the people they trust the most push through fear and failure or uncertainty, they learn that resilience is built, not born, and that they too can overcome hard things. These stories become a family blueprint for courage and determination. So I love it. As I thought really deeply about this, I thought of my own children and even relatives and ancestors and their grit stories. I thought of a great-grandfather of mine named Happy Smith. Isn't that a great name? Now, his real name was Horace, so maybe Happy's a better alternative. But Happy Smith was a police officer in Kansas City back in the early 1900s. Happy Smith had a wife, and if I remember right, 5 children. He was a beloved policeman, the kind of policeman that had a relationship with people, that when he directed traffic or whatever, people were stopping and talking to him, and he had a kind word to say to everyone. There was some gangsters that held up a bank, killed some people, got away, and Happy Smith ends up getting in a shootout with these guys. He tries to stop them, and they shoot him. And Happy Smith, my great-grandfather, is lying on the street in his own blood in Kansas City. And he's shooting back, and he takes out these 2 gangsters, and then he passes away. Once again, at age 38, leaving a wife and 5 kids. But to think that I've got that blood in me and my children have that blood in them, I love that. I love knowing that story. I love knowing the story about my grandfather, who started working for the Kansas City Southern Railroad at age 14 and worked his way up to the very top and became the vice president of that company and very successful. And the only thing that kept him from being the president is he never went to college. Had he gone to college, he could have been the president of a company, but just worked his heart out, just worked and worked and worked until he made it to the very top. And once again, the only reason for not going to college in his case was because he had to go to work at age 14 to help support his family. You know, I think of my own children and their grit stories. I think of our daughter Brittany and some of the hard and difficult things she's done in her life, including helping put a husband through medical school while having children, which is something a lot of people don't do anymore. Running the competitive races that she's run, always having a positive, happy attitude about everything. I think of our son Brandon, who just had no business starting as a college middle linebacker for a Division I college and being successful, being the captain, being the leader, being a starter for 3 years at undersized, 5'11", 230 pounds, but playing in the most dangerous part of that field and just never having any fear. I just admired that in him and still do today, as he's still tenacious. Think of our daughter Bethany, who's just done a lot of hard things in her life and challenging things, has done it with a smile, including a stillborn birth that could have rocked anyone's world, but knew that her trust and her faith was in a Heavenly Father. Think of our daughter Kinsey, who's just not afraid of anything, who faces everything head on, who's done difficult things in her life, who's been a leader, but also one who's never shied away from a challenge. Give me this mountain to climb. I think she's always had that attitude. Her twin sister, Maddie, I just think of Maddie's quiet, silent grit. I think of her right in the middle of COVID, having an appendix rupture and being rushed to the hospital in a time where the hospital staff, nurses, doctors didn't even want to get near anyone because they may have had COVID and they didn't know what that meant. So here's my daughter, who's not only pregnant, but lying on the tile floor of a hospital, writhing in pain. And they won't give her any medicine. They won't let her husband come in. That story today still infuriates me, but to think that she gritted her way through that and the Lord helped her through. I think of our daughter Cassidy, who had such a great social network at our high school in Texas and was doing so well and thriving. And then we move here her sophomore year, one of the most difficult things in her life, and she has to find a way to make it work and to try to make friends and to lose an identity and then regain it. Or even more recently, going through her first pregnancy and with having her gallbladder removed 1 week and 2 weeks later her appendix taken out, can't have any pain meds because she has a baby that she's carrying, and just bears that. Our daughter Callie, who's done hard things in her life over and over again, doesn't shy away from whatever's hard, loves a competition, who in high school starts to take up running as almost a hobby, and is frankly probably not that great at it, not good at all. I remember going to some of her meets and she was okay, but she just stayed with it. She just kept it up and stayed with it. And then it became her passion. And then she graduates from high school. She becomes this great runner. And now, by the time this podcast airs, she would have just run the Boston Marathon, which a lot of you runners know how hard it is to qualify for that. But she just stayed with it. She just persevered. I think of our daughter Natalie, who had some difficult things in her life. I think in her high school where she put all of her heart and soul her junior year into an election, and she lost, and she was devastated, but she didn't let it get her down. She didn't curl up in a ball and quit. She just said, you know what? I'm going to win next year, which she did. She came back the next year and won. She worked her whole life to be a great volleyball player, and then the first, tournament of the season, her senior year, she breaks her hand in a practice. And that was it. I mean, it was just devastating, but she just kept on going. She got involved in student government and she kept going. Maybe one of my favorite examples is my wife, Janie, who has done a lot of hard things in her life. She's not here to defend herself today, so I can talk about her, but the cool thing about her, like her own father, is she always has borne those hard things and those challenges in silence. She doesn't ever complain. Would never tell you she's in pain. She just bears it silently. It's pure grit, and I love it. And there's a few grit stories in my own life that we've tried to pass down to our children too, and I hope that's something that they've appreciated and that has given them great strength. One of the things that we could do in our homes is if we want to have a gritty home is, in my day, we had an expression. It was, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. I don't think I've heard that expression for 30 years. But why not teach that in our homes? Because we're tough, right? We want to tell our children, hey guys, we can handle it. We can do hard things. We want to teach our children to be flexible. We want to teach them the principle of perspective. We want to create what I call kind of a wimp-free culture in our homes, which is, you know what, guys, we're going to be tough. We're going to do hard things. We want to encourage our children to do hard things to the point that we're almost looking for something hard that they can do. And we certainly want to encourage them to try new things. So I'll finish today with this. 7 ways to teach your children grit. Number 1, teach your children grit by using examples from your life, from the life of your relatives, from the life of your own children. Those stories are there. Number 2, let your children do things for themselves. One of the cardinal rules in parenting is we never do anything for our children that they can do for themselves. When I used to watch that 3-year-old child push the chair all the way across the kitchen, hop up on top of that chair, climb up 3 cupboards like a Navy SEAL and to get a cup so that they could get a drink, I was like, cool, I'm not going to worry about them. They've got it. Let our kids struggle, of course with support, but let them struggle because that's where the lessons are. Number 4, teach our children and expect them to do hard things. Put challenges in front of them, like I said. Number 5, help your children find something they are passionate about. I love that. Number 6, help them do things that are outside of their comfort zone. So many times in our world today, when something becomes uncomfortable, our first instinct as a parent is to say, okay, you don't have to do that. If that makes you uncomfortable, let's not do that. And then normalize failure as part of the process. We are all going to fail. All of us are going to fail. We're all going to have heartbreaks. It's part of life. The greatest lessons I think I've ever learned have not come through success. They've come through failure. And gritting my teeth and saying, all right, game on. Here we go. We're doing it. I love this quote from Daniel Coyle. Grit isn't inborn. It's developed like muscle. And that development starts with awareness. Maybe I can close today with an experience that I was involved in, and many other people as well, years ago, 20 years ago to be exact, which is really crazy to think about. But it was just prior to the Christmas season of 2006. Some really good friends of ours, their son was diagnosed with a brain tumor. The kind of brain tumor where the lifespan is really short, 3 to 6 months. And the young man's name was Peter. And Peter began his treatment, and his parents were spending a lot of their time tending to Peter's needs, taking him to hospitals and doctors and appointments, while trying to balance raising their 3 other children. Peter's father, Scott, kept a detailed journal as they went through this experience together. And on Friday, December the 22nd, 2006, Scott recorded this. I found Peter this morning awake and curled up on the love seat in the TV room. It was just after 8 o'clock a.m. and everyone else in the house was still asleep. This would have been the Christmas holidays. I heard him say, "Hi, Dad," as I was walking to his room to wake him up for our daily trek down to the hospital. As I went over to say good morning to him, I could tell he had been thinking. He looked up at me with a little smile on his face and said, "You know what would be kind of fun? Riding a polar bear down a mountain like a sled while an avalanche was coming behind you." I looked at him for a moment and said, "You know, buddy, that sounds kind of like what you're doing right now." The mind of a 6-year-old never ceases to amaze me. So the idea was born. This is me talking now. And by the way, this story is published in a book called Heaven is Cheering You On. And I'm reading from that book. Hence, the idea was born of riding a polar bear down an avalanche. To a young boy, what could be scarier than a polar bear? Polar bears eat little boys. And then an avalanche? What can be worse than an avalanche to be buried alive? To surf a polar bear down an avalanche is to embrace the circumstances around us and then to master them. To survive an avalanche, you swim with the current if you are to survive. Trying to stay put, or more likely trying to outrun the slide, would almost mean certain death. To surf down the avalanche is to act and not be acted upon. Not long after Peter coined that expression, to surf a polar bear down an avalanche, one of his classmates and a friend in the ward named Caden created some artwork that captured that scene perfectly. And I'm looking at that picture right now of a young boy riding a polar bear down an avalanche. Peter's father, Scott, explained the polar bear down the avalanche metaphor in more detail. He said that fanciful notion, born of a thought Peter shared with his dad shortly after his diagnosis, symbolizes another one of Peter's Christ-like attributes, and that is courage. Ever since his diagnosis on December the 9th, Peter did indeed surf a polar bear down an avalanche as he battled his tumor, and never once did he ask why me or complain, though what was slowly transforming him and his life each day was unfair or terrible. He simply mounted that polar bear and took it for a ride. During his battle with a rare and aggressive form of cancer, Peter endured 30 radiation treatments, 7 months of various types of chemotherapy, 2 surgeries, and heaven knows how many pokes, pricks, yucks, and other assorted unpleasantries. He saw his hair begin to fall out and watched in dismay as his body gained 30 pounds as a result of the medications he needed to take to control the swelling in his brain. Did this deter him from having fun? Not in the least. He went to Disneyland and conquered Expedition Everest like a pro. He rode horses and made a movie at a dude ranch in Colorado. He played his first and only season of soccer as his team's goalkeeper, following his older brother's footsteps. He skied down a mountain, cavorted with rescue dogs, and drove a snowmobile in Montana, thanks to some friends. When his right hand went numb as a result of his progressing tumor, was he discouraged? Not a chance. He simply put his pencil in his left hand and moved on without a moment's hesitation. The journey of dying from cancer would seem like a maddening, terrifying prospect for almost anyone. But for Peter, he treated it like the chance to have an adventure of a lifetime. He treated it as though he had the opportunity to do something special and unique. He treated it as if he was surfing a polar bear down an avalanche, not even worrying about what would happen when his ride came to an end. He had the courage to see the wonder and the miracle of each moment he experienced. Now, there's so much more to that story, but I love the fact that as I've talked today about passing grit down to the next generation, I don't want to leave out another perspective, and that is that sometimes the younger generation can leave an imprint on an older generation and help us understand what grit really is all about. And we talk about Peter with courage, but I think he's the epitome of what grit really is. And that's what I hope for all of us. To ride the polar bear down the avalanche, to embrace the future with faith and hope and optimism. For us to ride that polar bear down the avalanche means to accept and understand the times in which we live, but we can swim with the current, not against it. And as much as we'd all like to go back to the 1950s and sit around our fireplaces every night with our families drinking Tang and watching black and white TV, those idyllic days are gone. We live in a different world. These are our days, though. And it doesn't do any good wishing to live in another time period. And so we embrace it. We ride the polar bear down the avalanche. We laugh despite the circumstances and have joy, even though it may be hard to find joy in some cases. Well, everyone, thank you for letting me share one of my favorite topics with you today. I apologize for being maybe a little too personal, but I'm grateful for this great attribute. And guess what? A lot of us see Jesus through the lens of love and tolerance and peace. But I'm here to tell you that Jesus Christ was one of the most courageous, most gritty figures in our world's history. Everyone, let's do something. LDS, let's do it. Let's share with our children this week a grit story from our own personal life And let's ask them about one of theirs as well. Let's create a culture of grit in our homes. Thanks for being with me today, and I'll look forward to being with you next time.